Glad everybody could make it out this morning. We're not going to take too much of your time up here. Just wanted to kind of recap, a year with TRESA, what's been going on, what we should be doing. And there's a few new things that have come out this year. Okay, a handful of new forms, a couple of new clauses, some to go along with the forms too. Now, you all should know by this point, okay, RECOinfoguide.ca, because we got to be sharing the RECO Info Guide before you're dealing with a client in terms of putting a representation agreement together. Okay, that's the main point we got to remember. You don't need to give this to them to show something. They need to have this before you enter into a representation agreement. Okay, that's what TRESA lays out. That's what they need. Now, some of you might have looked, there were other regarding self-represented parties. There used to be OREA forms like 216 and I think 311 or one of them that were the acknowledgement that they're self-represented. OREA got rid of those. They deleted them. I know somebody was asking the other day, where is the form? They're not on web forms anymore because they were pretty much redundant. So if you are dealing with somebody who's self-represented, okay, you still have to provide them the RECO Info Guide. Okay. That being said, if after you provide them, they say, Shake, you know what? I really don't need an agent. I can represent myself. You say, you know what? That's great. I'm going to give you another 2-page, okay, information and disclosure to self-represented party forms. And again, it may be a bit redundant, but this is a 2-page, disclosure that basically highlights the risks that they're going to undertake if they choose to be self-represented. So really, that's all you need. If you're dealing with somebody who's self-represented, yeah, you would have given them the RECO guide. They said, no, you know what, I don't want to be represented. And then you follow up, you email them this through the website as well, saying, hey, that's fine. You can be self-represented. Just here are the risks.
What if I had a guy do this, but didn't fill his form out? I didn't even know the offer was coming. We were having an offer presentation and an offer showed up. He's self-represented himself like 10 minutes before the presentation. I can't get him that in that time.
And then I would just do it at your earliest opportunity, right? Because there's nothing you can do in that regard if it just comes out of the blue, right? Say you guys, your seller chose to work with them.
They didn't work with it.
Yeah. Hypothetically, though, they chose to work with the self-represented party. All I would have done is I said, hey, I'm sending you this info because it's my duty under our governing body, RECO. I got to provide it to you. And again, he doesn't have to.
I don't need it.
They don't have to sign and acknowledge it. No.
Okay.
No, because again, there was no opportunity for you to do that. And you're not even working with this guy. He just brought it in off the street. Yeah. Right? So in that case, no, you don't need it at all. But if they wanted to work with the self-represented buyer, all I would do is send them this prior to us working. Say, hey, I see you're self-represented. The seller wants to work with you. I'm sending you this as a mandatory requirement on my part of our governing body of real estate. You send it to them, you go on with your day. And again, because both with the RECO guide and that, all we have to do is provide it and explain it. We don't need a signature, okay? If you can get a signature, great, you should be. But, some people, they don't want to sign nothing. In the case of a self-represented party, that's why OREA got rid of the forms. Acknowledgement that you're a self-represented party. And when those first forms came out, I was like, well, this is dumb. If they don't want to be self-represented, or if they don't want me to represent them, why would they sign anything that's not an offer? Right? That's why they got rid of them. So in terms of dealing with self-represented parties, again, RECO Info Guide, information and disclosure to self-represented parties. That's it. Okay, you're done. You can deal with them that way. And again, to reiterate, we cannot provide them services. We can only assist them if it is in service to a seller client. Okay, so go back to the buyer on a property, self-represented buyer. Okay, if you're representing the seller, you cannot write the offer for a self-represented buyer, okay? And they may say, oh, okay, well, what am I supposed to do? Well, in Ontario, an offer for purchase real estate just has to be on writing, Okay, they could write it on a piece of paper saying, I'll give you whatever for this. Okay, and then what you would do, go to your seller, you counter it. Or you would write an offer to sell. You write an offer irrevocable by your seller. Give it to the buyer. Now, don't make the irrevocable too long. You don't want to hog tie yourself, but give it to the buyer in that respect. But again, you can't go through the offer and walk them through and explain what this means, explain what that means, because you can't use your skill or your judgment when you're working with a self-represented buyer. So to keep yourself out of hot water, you can't write an offer for them. You can show them a property, you can give them info, okay? You can't give them your opinion, you can't explain an offer, and you can't write an offer for them. That's the whole purpose of them being self-represented, right? They say, well, I don't want to work with a realtor. Can you write the offer? No. Period. You can either write it from your seller or you say, go have your lawyer write it. And again, to recap what we were touching on just before the meeting, we all need to be using the designated representation forms. Now, I hope we all know what this means at this point, but we as a brokerage are using designated rep. And the reason we do that is to avoid in-house multiple representation, okay? It's to avoid Rob having a listing and Todd bringing an offer and that being multiple rep. So now, because before under brokerage rep, you guys would both owe each other's clients the same duties, okay? Just can't disclose price or motivation, okay? But now with designated rep, Todd is a designated rep buyer, Rob is a designated listing for his seller. Now it's no different than, say, selling a Royal LePage listing, okay? You can fully represent your client.
Dave, you make a mistake and use the old form. Can you change it and have them re-sign just that form? Is it good with the board?
You'd have to redo the listing, yeah.
Redo the whole listing?
Just
This piece?
yeah,
This-
just the 4-page listing.
Yeah.
Not the data
Not
input or
about
nothing.
the rest. Okay, the board will take that.
Yeah, I would.
Okay.
I'd have to check with them and say, hey, can we swap this out?
Yeah, okay.
They're really just concerned about the correct information,
Yeah,
right?
just before something comes in.
Yeah.
It's properly, because otherwise you forget, or I forget.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, and I can't see that being an issue. It's just as long as we have the right agreement in place. Okay. And again, this is just to, if anybody needs help on updating their transaction kits, if they have templates from before that had Form 200 in it or Form 300 in it and you want to update it and you don't really remember how, ask me, I'll show you. It's pretty simple. And again, we also have company templates, okay? While we're on the subject, if you're in your web forms, you log in at the front, okay? If you go to create transaction, you can see right here, the second option is a template. Okay, and the ones that are labeled company are the ones I've created, and they have all the up-to-date forms. Okay, so you can pull those ones up if you need, if you don't have your own templates. If not, if you have your templates and you want to swap them out, I can show you how to do that. It's pretty simple. But again, just to reiterate, we should be using designated rep. It's the exact same form as 200, except it has the extra line where you can fill out, yes, I am the designated representative for the seller. And on that point too, okay, Schedule A for representation agreements. These cannot be blank. Okay, we cannot leave these blank. We have to fill in the services we are providing our seller or buyer clients. Okay, very simply, we have added clauses into here. The company templates already have these filled out, but we have added clauses to web forms. Okay, so if you're in here, you're adding a clause just like an offer. Just click your cursor in there. Click the add clause button. Office clauses right here. There's 4 of them. Yeah. There's 4 of them you can see, and we've named them, okay, for a buyer, for a landlord, for a seller, for a tenant. And they even have the associated form number with them. So, okay, even if you don't know, I'm on Form 271, here's there for a seller, okay? You insert it. you know, and it might be a little jumbled up. So, okay, you put the enter button. I don't know why it does that, but here it is here. And we are listing, again, these are just advisory services.
Right.
Okay, if you talk to any trainer at REA or anybody at RICO for TRESA, they basically say, and I say too, it's best to just put advisory services. Because if you're promising other services, yeah, if you promise staging, you got to put staging in here. If you promise drone photos or eye guides and that, just add them in. These are absolute bare bone. And again, you can go through and edit this as you want. I'm not saying you have to use this clause. I'm saying I put this in there to make your life easier. Okay, you know, we're advising the seller on market conditions. We're providing a CMA. You know, we're managing information. We're providing feedback. We're vetting potential buyers. Okay, again, we're showing them how to handle multiple offers. Okay, these are just advisory services. And again, in case you didn't see, we added the clause in here in case the property sells before any or all of these services are completed, commission is still due in full.
Right.
Okay, and that was important for us, especially if we're talking staging or that. You know, if the stager can't get in on the first weekend it's up, and you get a offer and it sells, I don't want no lawyer saying, oh, well, you know, you promised he would stage, and they didn't. Well, okay, what's the cost of staging? We'll deduct that off the commission, right? We don't want that happening. I'm not saying it would. I'm not even saying it can. But with what's gone on in real estate with lawyers, I don't doubt that somebody might try it. So again, we're just putting it in to protect your commission. And this last clause, if you're looking at it, if a seller asks, essentially this just says, in the event that, you know, Shake can't provide one of these services, you know, he authorizes Pat to do so. And again, we say this because the difference is, again, designated rep, there's no multiple rep in-house. The only multiple rep you have is if you double N. But that being said, if Shake has a listing and he's sick or he's on vacation and he gets an offer, okay, he's the representative for the seller, okay? Anybody at our company can provide his seller a service. So Renee could do an open house. She could do a showing for Shake's seller, but Renee cannot advise Shake's seller because he's designated as the one for representation. So all the duties, fiduciary, et cetera, that fall under representation is only on Shake. So we added that clause to say Shake is sick, Shake's away, he gets an offer, okay? Now when it comes time to dealing with an offer, it falls under representation.
Right.
Okay, so now what that says is Casey can fill in. He says, Casey, can you present this offer to my sellers? I'm unavailable, right? And the reason I put that in is because without that, you'd have to do an amendment to the listing, adding Casey as a designated rep, right? So she can present the offer and then afterwards remove her. And that's a pain in the butt, you know, I'll say that's the only thing. That's why I have that clause in there, okay? So again, it's in there for your convenience. Again, if you don't like it, you can delete it. I'm not saying you have to, because I've had somebody contest it saying, well, you can put my listing to anybody. You know what? That's not the spirit of it, but delete it if you don't want it. It's there to make your life easier in case you're ever in a scenario where you can't provide a service that falls under representation to your seller. And again, add clause, office clauses. Easy to find, easy to use, and you can't leave it blank. Now this one, 325. I think you should all know this form by this point.
Yeah.
We've harped on it a bit. You know, and I will say from the last time Rico was peeking through our forms, you know, we were missing a handful of these. So again, TRESA changed the timing of consent for multiple rep. Okay, that's why this form exists, and its counterpart is 326 for a buyer. Okay, because before, you know, if you're representing the seller, okay, listing goes up, you pick up a buyer on a Saturday on your own listing. Okay, you enter into a buyer rep with them, you write the offer for them, but offer presentation's not till Tuesday. Okay, and what did it used to be? Confirmation of cooperation. We're consenting to multiple rep on the confirmation of co-op 320. Okay, but TRESA says, no, we're not doing that anymore, because what happened is you were in multiple rep for Saturday, Sunday, Monday, Tuesday. You were in multiple rep for 4 days before you got consent of your current client to enter into multiple rep. So what TRESA said is they said, no, you have to get consent the moment multiple rep is formed. Okay, and again, that's why I'm saying, do this with your listing. Okay, some of the area trainers, they say, oh, you can't do that because you don't know what type of multiple rep you'll be in. Okay, we're a designated rep brokerage. I know the type of multiple rep we'll be in. The only multiple representation you should ever be in is when you represent the seller and you individually also represent the buyer. That's the only time you'll be in multiple rep. So you'd have them initial the middle option here, okay? Multiple representation and designated representation. That's saying the same designated rep for the seller is also the designated rep for the buyer, okay? So this is one extra page, bring it with you on your listing and just, make it a habit to have them initial. Okay, they ask you, Ivano, what's this for? You say, well, Mr. and Mrs. Seller, in the event that I find a buyer willing to put an offer on your home, are you okay if I represent them? And 9 times out of 10, they're going to say, Ivano, just sell my house. Yes, I'm okay with that. Okay, so you're getting consent beforehand. We also still need consent on 320, okay, on confirmation of cooperation, because that's the spot where all parties involved can see that they all consent. Because this form is between the client and the brokerage, okay? So again, this is important. We're getting these done. And again, the only time we absolutely need it is when there is multiple rep. So even if you don't get it signed at the time of listing, the only thing you're doing is inconveniencing yourself. And I say get it signed at the time of listing because if you're having an open house on the weekend, and you have a buyer that comes in, this might be rare these days because, it's been a while since I've done an open house. But if you have a buyer that comes in and say, well, I want to write an offer. Do you have you vet them, you ask them the questions. Do you have a realtor? No, you want to be represented? Can I write the offer for you? Yeah. I want you to write the offer for me. Okay. Well, you want to write the offer now. I have blank offers with me. I do every time I go to an open house. I'm not going to meet you later, meet you tomorrow, because I know if I let you walk out the door, chances are you're probably not going to write it. I want to strike while the iron's hot. Okay. But if you don't get 325 initialed at the time of listing, what you'll have to do is you'll have to say, that's great, I'd love to write an offer with you. But first, I have to go ask my seller if it's okay. Okay? And what if your seller's out to dinner, right? Or they're out for the day with their kids. Okay? You're not going to get an answer not till the next day, and you can't write an offer before that. You have to get consent before you go here. So it's a lot easier to just get this done, because then if you're in a situation that arises where a buyer comes up and they say, yeah, I want to write an offer, you say, it's great. We can do it. I represent the seller. That's fantastic. We'll do a buyer rep. We'll also do 326, which is your acknowledgement that I represent the seller and you're going to be in multiple rep. Okay? So again, if you're in multiple rep, you have to have this. Okay? TRESA's cracking down on that form. This is about consent from the buyer or from the seller as well.
325 and 326.
325 for the seller, 325 or 326 for the buyer.
Do you have to get the buyer to sign it too?
Correct.
Yeah.
Just include it with the offer?
I would include it with the buyer rep.
Yeah.
Like I'm sitting with the buyer,
Yeah.
right? I already represent the seller.
Okay.
They know that because they came through my listing. I told them that.
Yep.
And they said, yeah, that's fine. I want to write an offer with you. Great. We'll do the buyer rep. We'll do 326, initial the same spot. Says, yes, I represent the seller. I'm okay with being a multiple rep.
So meaning that you have to get the form signed before you write the offer?
This says the time of the offer when you're doing buyer rep.
It's when you're doing the buyer rep.
Okay.
It's when you're entering into multiple rep, which if you already represent the seller, if you're signing a buyer rep, you're entering in at that point. So get it signed then. And with a buyer, it's like, it's not something I'd normally get initialed beforehand, because if you're working solely with a buyer, the only time you're going to be in multiple rep is if, you know, you're showing one of your listings or you're showing a private listing and you end up representing them. So that's easier to do there. But the tougher one timing wise is the listing. You don't want to be caught not being able to write an offer, right? Yeah.
So what if somebody signed a listing with the old form and they do multiple rep if it's in office?
Then if you signed a listing on an old form and Renee brings you an offer and Renee has 371 with her buyer, she's designated with her buyer, and she's assuming you have to tell her, hey, Renee, by the way, this is a brokerage rep listing, so we're going to be in multiple rep. Because even if Renee has designated buyer and you have a brokerage seller, okay, you know, Renee is the only one that represents her buyer, but the entire brokerage represents your seller. Okay.
So, in the case of mine, when I was on the right form, but when I brought her an offer that I was representing a buyer, she refused to sign it. So I couldn't I had to get someone else to write the offer.
Yeah.
I know, but it's long ago.
Yeah.
But this form came out after. But anyways, and she's that kind of person, so whatever, sorry, excuse me. But do I have to get her to, once the seller signs, and if that offer didn't go through, another offer came possibly that you represented, do you have to get it to that person to re-sign? Do you have to argue again for 14 hours before you get it re-signed?
No, because they already consented to multiple rep. Because they're not consenting to you representing an individual buyer. They're consenting to multiple rep as
because it says as the offers, that form says it has to be presented at the time that the offer comes in, like each time. So that's why it's confusing. So I thought every time you come in, if, you know.
It's just when multiple rep is created.
Okay.
Yeah. So if you have multiple buyers, you don't have to get that signed 3 different times.
If I'm doing an open house for Shake, he designates me to do it or whatever, and I pick up a buyer, I don't have to get 326.
Yeah.
No.
Signed to give him the offer.
No, because it'd be your buyer,
Right, okay.
right?
I didn't know if he designated me to do the open house, I'm not considered part
No,
of it.
and you wouldn't have to be designated to do the open house for him. Okay. So say he's the only designated, but say the seller comes home and, you know, hey, how's the open house? Yeah, you let them know how it went, and then they want to know your opinion on the price or what it might sell for. You say, look, I can't really comment on that because Shake is your designated rep, right? So I don't want to, I can't really advise you on that fact.
Yeah, but they would.
I know they would. We're talking by the actual,
by the book.
how it works, right?
Can I say, I'll tell Shake what I think, and he can decide if he wants to tell you?
Yeah, because he's the one representing them. But that's for multiple rep. And again, it's just important we get those done because, you know, this is, like Renee said, she had a seller that said, no, I don't want you to represent them. So imagine what would happen if you got an offer, and then at the time you came in and the seller's like, whoa. You know, I didn't say this was okay.
Yeah.
Right? So now you got somebody that wants to buy and your seller's saying no, so now you're scrambling. Okay? That's why this form is in here. And then the one form everybody loves, our Schedule B. If the deposit is going in our trust account, we have to get this signed. Period. Okay? That's simple. Because it's an interest-bearing trust account, RICO says you have to disclose that fact to the buyer. Okay? And in the case that the interest from the deposit is going anywhere besides back to the buyer, then it has to be noted in the offer. That's why this is on a Schedule B. Okay? And it's simply put that fact. You know, because if there's any amounts over 85, you know, the interest goes there. Any amount under would be retained by the brokerage. Okay. That's why this has to be in Schedule B. Okay.
Gord, has ever have this happened that somebody has an interest on their deposit over $85 that they had to give back the buyer, or is it just another pain?
Yeah. No, it happens there. But the thing is, even if we were giving it back, it'd be a pain, right? Because interest on the trust account, it's the rightful owner is the buyer. But even if the buyer wants to collect, they have to give us a social insurance number, right? Because they have to claim it as income.
I mean, it doesn't make any sense.
That's how it works.
It's big deals, big development.
And it really, the only time people would really they'd say, yes, please put it in an interest bearing, is if you're doing like a large commercial deal, right? Where you're talking large deposits, like, 5, 6 figure deposits.
Like $2,000, $5,000, $10,000.
Yeah, because if you're tying up that much of their money, they're going to want to make something back on it. And at that point, it's an $80 fee because, we got to cut a check and do that and do this. It takes our staff time. They're going to say that's fine. Okay. So that'd be a scenario where they'd want it. But again, even if you're the listing agent and an outside company's bringing a buyer, you got to say, you got to please include the Schedule B. It's in all your listings. It's in the attachment. Says all offers need to include it, but still it's our responsibility as the listing brokerage to ensure that the Schedule B is in there. And when you do put the Schedule B into an offer, you'll note here, because I know we were missing a lot of these too, on the first page of the APS, okay, right here, schedules. A is always defaulted because it's part of the 6-page offer. You got to put B, okay? It's saying that there is a Schedule B attached to this offer. Because when Rico came through, they were kind of, stingy on that, saying, well, you got the Schedule B, but it wasn't noted on the offer that there is a Schedule B. We're like, really? You can note that as well there. Now, to some of the new stuff. One of the new forms we have is 218, which you'll see is just a representation agreement. It's not a buyer representation agreement. It's not a seller representation agreement. It's just a representation agreement. Representation and services. Okay? Now, what this can be used for, say you're doing a letter of opinion, a CMA, say you have your own buyer, you find a private listing, somebody selling it on Facebook or Kijiji, and they say, you know what, Arvin, yeah, I will pay you a commission. I agree to pay you a commission, right? They don't want their house listed on the MLS. They don't want this or they want that. We used to have to do that. You could just simply do this, okay, between the seller, between the brokerage, and then, there's a spot for designated, just like a listing agreement. There's all, the regular setup here. But then it says right here, in consideration of the brokerage providing the following service. You lay out the service you're doing, whether you're just doing a CMA or providing a letter of opinion. But in this case, let's say, well, I'm presenting you an offer. Okay. You would simply just put presentation of an offer. Okay. That's the service. You'll agree to pay me a commission of, X.
So this is the only form we need for a private? We
No,
don't need,
there's a new form. There's a commission agreement that came in through.
Hey, that's the same thing, commissioner payment, same thing.
Yeah. But this is just, I would still probably use a shorter listing there and just do it exclusive. To me, it's easier. But this is a simple 1-page rep agreement. If you're doing anything that doesn't really fall under, a trade of real estate, but you still need representation for it, I think that's really the spirit that this is designed for.
why can't we just use that form?
For
Instead of, you're dealing with a private seller and you agree to pay commission. It's
That's what I'm
listed
saying.
yeah, it's a lot simpler for them to do here because
just use that.
And I would use my discretion on that, because some sellers, they might, they don't want nothing to do with you. They'll read the clauses, talks about marketing, for the actual listing agreement. This just says, if I present, you put the service. If I present you an offer that you end up accepting, you agree to pay me.
That's right.
Period.
Yeah, when
Yep.
when they're
That's it.
commission, they always say, how many commissions? They don't say what your
Yeah.
commission.
And then that way you saved your buyer from having to pay the commission, because now the seller's going to pay it. And now the seller would pay it before. And there is another way I can get this in if there is a self-represented seller. Okay, that is one of the new forms I'm going to go into too.
There's no place for names or anything.
But that's more.
Yep, no, up top.
Oh, no,
But-
but names of the buyer to protect you, that this buyer's coming in, that you do that in the remarks then. Right?
Yeah, that's right.
If a fee, if so-and-so buys your, that
Well, then I would just, because the only time you'd have it is you're only having it for that.
short time, exactly. for
Yeah,
that
I would just put under services, in consideration of the following services, me bringing you an offer you find acceptable,
From-
and accepting it,
from-
selling your home?
yeah.
You could even put that to make it more specific, from the buyer, Todd Smith,
Yes.
right?
Just to protect you, and you only need that form, and that's it.
Well, you're representing them in that point, and it would be multiple rep, but yeah,
Okay.
yeah. You're basically getting this signed so you can get paid.
Okay, yeah.
But that's really more for CMAs and things like that.
Yeah, I was gonna
Realistically, yeah. It's more for,
Opinion or something.
yeah, because to give that, they are relying on your judgment and your skill and they're relying on your,
So I can
you
use that
advising
for-
them.
I can use it for letter of opinion and stuff like that, okay.
Yep, and you just put for providing a letter of opinion on the value of the property. You'll agree to pay me, $300 or whatever the going rate is now.
Yeah, I used that on the lease that I offered to that lease that was not listed, and it was with the developer that I sent him.
Yeah.
That was good, yeah.
Yeah, that's the one we talked about, yeah.
Yeah.
But it can be used for that respect, right? But I still think if you are able to get a listing, do it on the listing agreement, do it exclusive, and then I'll show you one of the new clauses for that actually that will supersede anything else in there. But truly, I think the design of this one, since it is so simple, is like for a letter of opinion or for, doing a CMA or any other service you're doing for somebody that requires representation and you want to get paid. Now, the services I was talking about. So let's go back to the listing. Where is it? And say, you are able to represent a private deal, okay? They have new clauses. Serve for services, just SERV, okay? And let's say you did find a private seller, they agree to pay you a commission, okay? You're gonna do the listing agreement with them, short amount of time, designate who the buyer is gonna be, and you can put this in your Schedule A, because we have to have services in the Schedule A. Now, you wouldn't put the full suite of services that we've created and put in there, because you're not gonna show the property, you're not gonna, you're only, the seller acknowledges and agrees that the only service to be provided by the brokerage or designated rep is the presentation of an offer for the seller's consideration.
Oh, I like that.
Okay, that's it. They added printed ones there for that case. And even further you could go in. You wouldn't have to, but they have other ones in because, this one says there will not be providing a market analysis. Okay, that's the second one, disclosure of info. Now, I had somebody ask me this question the other day. Now, if you're doing a listing for someone, sometimes, not often, the seller's kind of under the gun and they say, just tell people this is what I want, right? If you got a listing and the seller says, just tell them I want 575, right? I just need this gone, okay? I'd be putting this in my listing agreement if I knew ahead of time, okay? If you don't know ahead of time, you always got to get written permission to disclose private information to somebody. But they added this one to say, yeah, the seller acknowledges and consents to the disclosure of the information provided by the seller respecting the amounts the seller is prepared to accept for sale price to other prospective buyers. Okay? And then same thing for disclosure of motivation. But these are the 4 new clauses they added in regards to service. The main one that will probably see use, like I said, in that scenario, you have a buyer, you find a private seller. Okay, hey, I'll do the listing for you, no problem, exclusive. We're not going to put it on the MLS. You know, the only service, look right here in the Schedule A, the only service I'm going to give you is presentation of an offer. I'm not going to show your house to other people. You know, I'm not going to do anything else. Don't worry about it. This is just here to say, yeah, I'm going to represent you. I'm going to give you an offer. If you like it, if it goes through, you pay me.
Wouldn't that be nice?
Wouldn't that be great?
Wouldn't that be
That's the goal, eh? That is the goal. So that covered the representation agreement. And then the new commission agreement, okay? 223. Now, let's say the other side of that coin. You have a buyer, you find a seller that isn't represented, and they say, you know what, no, I don't want to be represented. Okay? You know, I don't want to sign anything with you, just sell my house. Okay? But they're still open to paying commission. Right? You know, we've had that where you call it 9 times out of 10, it's not that they don't want to work with a realtor, it's that they don't want to pay commission. Right? Or they do want to pay commission, you know, they just want a certain amount in their pocket. Okay? So now we have this commission agreement we can do with the self-represented seller. Because you can see up here, it's between the buyer and the seller. This is not an agreement between the seller and the company. Okay. Now there is a clause to go along with this that would be put in the agreement of purchase and sale in Schedule A. I'll show you. But this basically is an agreement between both parties, and this would go along with an offer. Okay. I'd probably get this signed ahead of time if there's a self-represented seller, and they say, I don't want you to represent me, but I will pay you commission. Okay. That's great. Agree on whatever commission amount you're going to pay. You know, present this to both parties, get it signed, and then there's a clause, SRP-MIR. I'll show you that, but it goes with this. Basically says in consideration with an offer made, you know, a spec to the address up top, seller agrees to pay REMAX Preferred Realty blank % of commission, okay? And it lays out right here so the seller can understand if the deposit doesn't cover commission, there will be extra amount. And essentially, it's directing the seller's lawyer to pay any excess that the deposit doesn't cover. Like if it's a $5,000 deposit, you know, $8,000 commission, do the math. Right? Again, simple, 1 page, and I'll show you the clause that goes with it. Where's my Form 100? And you can write this clause number down as well, as I show you here. So we'll go here, add clause. It's SRP/MERE. It's the only one, okay? Talks about commission remuneration. I'll make it a little bigger. Now again, this is saying the same thing that 223 says. Says the seller's lawyer is irrevocably directed to pay the brokerage, okay, REMAX Preferred Realty, the unpaid balance of the entire commission, okay? And you would use that in conjunction with 223, right? So this would be the process. You find the seller, you negotiate commission, they still don't want to be represented. You fill out 223, okay? You put the buyer, the seller, the commission amount they agreed on, they both sign it. You present the offer with this clause in it. Okay? Because this clause references that form.
So that's not a schedule.
This goes on the Schedule A, correct?
Schedule
If you're using 223, you're putting this clause that I said,
Right.
the this one, the SRP-MIR, Muir, commission remuneration clause. If you're using 223, you put in this clause in the offer.
So we offer in Form 100.
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah, this is on the APS. Sorry if I breezed through that. But you'd be putting this on Form 100 as one of your clauses in the offer. Okay? And you can see there's even a note. There's a note for you that says, hey, this clause is to be inserted into the agreement of purchase and sale when using Form 223.
Oh, okay.
Right?
Why do you need that clause if it's already on 223?
Because it needs to be agreed. The heck? It needs to be agreed in the offer. Because 223 is outside of the offer.
So this is the board's clause,
This is a REA's clause.
yeah.
Yeah. This is a REA's clause that you'll be inserting. So if you're using 223, you have to have the clause, because you can't just have 223, because again, they're going to go to the contract, the APS. The APS doesn't say anything about that, right? And again, because 223 is not, this is not an agreement between REMAX Preferred and the seller, because TRESA said, you know, if you're entering into an agreement between brokerage and client, there has to be a provision for representation, not commission, representation. There is no representation in this form. We're talking about a self-represented seller. So that agreement, 223, is between the buyer and the seller. It's not between REMAX and the seller. It's between the buyer and the seller. Saying, hey, this clause we have in our contract that we agreed to both be bound by states that you're going to pay commission. Okay? And it states how. You're going to direct your lawyer to give us any excess if, you know, the deposit doesn't cover the commission. And again, so if you are using that, I think it even says on the 223, you got to have this in there. Okay? And I saw this as a note, like you would delete this last line. This is just a note for you since it's new, saying, hey, if you're using this clause, you're using it with Form 223.
So just delete that out of there.
Yeah. So if you're inserting that last note, just, you know, take that out. I would imagine. But again, that's another way we can get paid now from an SRP. That makes it easier. Because before we had a clause that Rico said we could draft up, but now we have an actual something on paper outside of the clause that says, yeah, they agreed. And again, it's between the buyer and the seller, so it's enforceable. Now, the last one, 602, is a new disclosure form. So if there's anything you ever need to disclose, if you need to make disclosures before, you know, if we had done it on a note or you had just sent an email, you always did it in writing. I would never disclose a material fact over the phone because you could just say, you know, hey, I never knew that. Okay. So they created this form 602 and they made it obvious, just called it disclosure. This is anytime you as a realtor are making a disclosure to a buyer or seller. Okay, period. Right? And they have different, different pre-written ones you can go over. It says here, okay, is the disclosure being made to the buyer? Is it being made to the seller? Again, you'd put up top, this is between so-and-so and the brokerage. Okay, disclosing you're providing services. Okay, in the case of it is a multiple rep or you are dealing with an SRP, you're like, hey, you know, I am providing services to these people. Disclose whether you entered into an agreement which may affect whether an offer to buy is accepted. To me, I read that and I would say, okay, if my listing says if I sell it, I'll knock off 1% or something like that. Because again, if you make that promise, they want you to put it in there. Normally, I would just use my discretion because sometimes it wouldn't be in there. If you are in multiple rep, you might not want to do that because that could scare off other offers, and you want them to get the most money. So that's a conversation you always have with your seller, anyways. You say, yeah, I'll knock a point off. if it's my own buyer, but if we're in multiple rep, not gonna. Because if I knock a point off in multiple rep, I have to make a disclosure to other people saying, hey, you know, if the seller accepts my offer, it's at a lesser cooperating commission amount, right? So now they have to offer more to compensate, and you might lose offers that way. One of the options here is talking about disclosure of interest on a trust account. Now, again, that would be if it is going directly back. It doesn't apply in our case because, like I said, regarding our Schedule B, if the interest is going anywhere besides back to the buyer, then it has to be agreed on in the contract. Okay, this would be if there was an interest-bearing trust account and it was a complete flow through. The buyer gets it back immediately, then the disclosure is just made to the buyer in that respect. But in our case, needs to be agreed on in the offer since the interest may be going somewhere other than back to the buyer.
Have you ever had a buyer refuse to sign a Schedule B?
Not that I know of, but if they did, you know, we just pay them back anyways.
Okay, so if the seller wanted to accept your offer but they refuse to sign the Schedule B?
Then just get the offer signed.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay.
And again, she makes a good point. Like you would never forego putting an offer together over a Schedule B because that doesn't, you know, we would deal with it at that point. If we just have to give the interest straight back, then we'll do that.
Okay.
Right? But again, RICO tells us as a brokerage and subsequently you as representatives of the brokerage that if there is interest in the deposit or in the trust account, we have to disclose that to the buyer. And if that interest is going anywhere except back to the buyer, it has to be agreed on in the APS. That's why we have the Schedule B. But again, if it was an issue for some reason there, right, you get the deal done.
I've only had it happen once.
Yeah. If it ever happens, you get the deal done. We'll figure it out later. You let us know. We just, you know, we'd write a check back to the buyer for, you know, $12.11, whatever the,
Yeah.
you know, whatever the interest is on that deposit, right? And then again, there's two other boxes you can check down here. One of them says material fact. One is just other if there's any disclosure you need to make. But say you are disclosing material fact, right? Like there's a crack in the foundation or something, right? I want something in writing.
Would you put somebody died in the house or there's some other problem in there?
Well, it'd be if somebody was murdered maybe, but yeah, people die in houses all the time. But, you know, say if that was the case, you know, or if someone committed suicide, right? And you found out about it.
That's what I've done.
Yeah. Then maybe you'd be making it here. There is another form that's not super new. It came out last year is 299, which is just a seller disclosure about latent defects. And again, that's a good form to use if you're
Logging to you or something.
well when you're having discovery conversations with your seller. You can use that form if they do say, well, you know, the basement floods every time it rains, or you know, yeah, we had a contractor through and the main beam is cracked or whatever it may be. We're talking about a material defect, and we find that out. We can put that on form 299. It's something we fill in there, and you'd give to a buyer. There's a spot for a buyer to sign it before they present an offer.
So we used to have a SPI form also, remember that?
The SPIS?
Yeah. So that can eliminate that.
Yeah, I wouldn't usually use that because that could just end your seller in hot water if they don't know something, like if there's something they don't know about or they forgot. Or like they never knew there was a old, you know, tank buried on the property or something. And then the buyer tries to put a pool in and they have an SPIS from the seller that states there is none of that. Then you're talking, I would never do that. I'd say, you know what, buyer, do your own due diligence.
Yeah.
Right? But 299 is more, we're talking material facts. If there's an issue wrong with the house. And again, if you are talking about a stigmatization, you could put it on that too. But if we're talking about disclosures that need to be made after the fact or like a one-off disclosure, this is the form Oria added. It's TRESA compliant that we can just make directly to a buyer or seller if there's any disclosure that needs to be made. And again, I want to do a disclosure in writing because I don't want, you never do it over the phone. You could we do email before, but if you're doing it, do it on the proper form. Because then that makes sure we're being compliant with our regulations.
So you have this form signed when you did the listing?
No, this is just a, say you do have the listing and a buyer comes through and they say, yeah, I want to make an offer. Okay, you could fill this form out, right? Have them sign it and say, hey, I'm disclosing the fact to you. The seller told me that, this corner of the basement gets water every time it rains, right? You'd kind of use it for that.
Okay.
Yeah. Basically, anytime you're trying to disclose a fact, okay, and you want a paper trail that says, yes, I did disclose that to you, because I don't want the deal getting torpedoed or someone getting sideways or getting pissed saying, well, you never told me that, or you never disclosed this, you're supposed to disclose it. Well, we did, and we have a form, right? And that's why we have that. It's got names, it's got signatures. We're covering our butt. That's always the main game. But those are the 3 new forms. That's a bit of our recap there. And that's kind of all I wanted to go over today, because we covered 218, that representation agreement, say you're doing any services that require representation you want to get paid for. 223, our commission agreement, right? And the clause to go along with it, if you wrote it down. Yeah. And then 602, our new disclosure agreement. But again, I don't expect you to be 100% perfect on all this stuff. If you need a reminder or you forget, you all have my cell.
Don't leave town.
Yeah, I won't.